And now to our speaker, whom I had not met until today. And first of all, I didn't recognize her when she walked in because I just assumed she was someone coming to hear Dr. Sutton. And then we started talking. We found out we had some things in common. We both speak German. She she's grown up all over the world as a military brat, but went to school in Germany and had a German mother. She has a fantastic position at Vanderbilt, and she's going to be telling you about what she's able to do with her time. One of her tasks is associated with Fort Negley from Vanderbilt's inspiration. So let her tell you about it. Dr. Angela Sutton.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Here, let me get back to the front of my presentation, and we can start. Before I get started, I just want to warn you about me. So I have about 2 hours of material that I am going to give to you in 55 minutes. Fortunately for me, I speak really, really fast, so I hope you've all had your coffee. But if there's anything you've missed, or if you can't hear me, just pop your hand up and I can repeat. Please do hold your questions till the end, though, because there's just so much material to get through. But I'm so excited to tell you a little bit more about that. So first things first, who am I? Well, oh no. Why is it doing that? Okay, well, now you know. I was hoping it would do that at the beginning, but I guess I'm not in control of my own PowerPoints today. Okay, so I'm a research assistant professor. What that means is that I'm a non-teaching faculty. I spend a lot of time doing research, and my research is Fort Negley. My research is the people associated with Fort Negley and all of the wonderful descendants who still live in and around Nashville, who have so much oral history that they've been holding on to in their families. And that they are now willing to share with the world, which is really wonderful. I'm also an assistant dean there, so I do a lot of work with the graduate school, making sure that our PhD students have what they need to get through the programs. Academic initiatives are all kinds of projects that come up that need someone to take point. So do a lot of projects and absolutely love what I do there. Okay, yes. And my biggest research project to have come out of all of this is the Builders and Defenders database. Now, I wanted to recognize Fletch Koch because she is one of the people who was sort of an inspiration for this database. Many, many years ago, back when the fort was in danger, when we were all afraid that the fort would be turned into a bunch of condos or some kind of a mixed-use development, Fletch had the idea of trying to find all of the people who were associated with this space. Up until then, it was really difficult to do because the military record keepers, it was not their first training, right? The clerks in the military were not trained to keep records. They sort of did the best that they could with what they had. And so Fletch found some money for us, and she hired Natalie Goodwin at the Tennessee State Library and Archives to do some sleuthing and to transcribe the names of all the laborers who were working in several of the fortifications of Nashville, because there was a whole defense system, right, that Brandon kind of talked about a little bit last month. And so with that was such a wonderful start to the database. I wrote a grant. I got 2 grants, which is really wonderful, and I used that money to hire other students to go in and finish the job and find all of the people who worked in Nashville's defenses, who worked on the railway, working with critical wartime infrastructure, who fought in the USCT, the black sailors who were involved in the Navy during the naval blockades when we first occupied Nashville. And put them all together here so that descendants can find their ancestors. So if you go to buildersanddefenders.org, it's a very robust site that has a lot of interpretive elements as well. We've got a ton of lesson plans for those of you who are teachers or homeschoolers. There's something for everybody at every grade level, whether that's in a public school, private school, or homeschool. We want to make sure that all of Tennessee's children at least have the option to learn about their own history before looking into some of the bigger narratives. So last month, Brandon Hewlett told us a little bit about what was below the fort, right? This is an image I stole directly from him. And he worked with the geospatial scholars to locate some of the original retrenchments in the Battle of Nashville. And those of you who have seen me speak before, I recognize a few of the faces there, will also know that I'm also like a really big fan of looking at what's below the surface, right? So a current grant that I'm working on is a partnership between myself at Vanderbilt and then an archaeologist at MTSU, Dr. Andrew Wyatt, as well as the CEO of the African American Cultural Alliance, Miss Janine Blackman. She's also a board member here. And then there's also Mix Claley Peacock, who is working with New South Associates, which is a cultural resource management firm. And together, we have done some pretty amazing things. So the grant is for ethnography and archaeological research, which means that I find the people who have lived on this land, and I find the people who have lived on this land and ask them about it, and then the archaeologists go dig where the people tell them to. And we found some really amazing artifacts over on the Bass Street side, which is here. So if you think about where the Science Center is, that whole area used to be human settlement, right? Mostly black people live there, and they lived there for 80 years uninterrupted. And there's a lot that the ground can tell us. We haven't found anything valuable monetarily, but we found things that are invaluable historically. All right, so I cannot tell you how rare sites like this are, but it's a Reconstruction era black settlement. And if you know anything about how cities grow, if you're interested at all in like urban history, urban development, you'll know that these places are often the very first places that cities choose to build on when they modernize. So urban renewal was infamously called the Negro removal by W.E.B. Du Bois, who taught here at Fisk, right? And so you can see here that St. Cloud Hill, where Fort Negley was, there was this robust neighborhood of mostly black people who lived there. And then when the highways came in, they bulldozed everything to make space for them. They specifically chose black neighborhoods to put the highways through. And that disrupted a lot of the history of what we know about black people in the city. So now, what does Bass Street have to do with Fort Negley? Let's take a bird's eye view of everything, okay? So there was a section of the neighborhood as large as Edge Hill or Napier, that was right at the foot of our fort. And you can't see it now because we had our own urban renewal Negro removal project, right? The homes were bulldozed and the highways and children's museum were put in. And slowly, much of the city was forgotten, or had forgotten the neighborhood, right? But let's back up. Oh, why is there an empty slide there? Okay, well, I think this PowerPoint has taken some liberties with how I've arranged my slides, but we'll muddle through as best as we can. All right, so then let's move here. So this is the first photograph that we have that is known to anybody of the people who settled at the Bass Street community. So let's ask, how and why did Bass Street get there? And is it related to the Civil War? Spoiler, yes. So of course we know a little bit of the history, and I'm going to take you through it really super fast, like 10 minutes to know the whole history of Nashville and the Civil War. But so we have like 62, right? Nashville is occupied, and it becomes a Union-held area. And we have this map here that shows us of all the fortifications. You can see the retrenchments that connect those fortifications. Fort Negley is like, yeah, that didn't help, I'm sorry. But there's a whole entire encircling sort of system of fortifications that protects the Capitol building, right? The idea was that Nashville was the second most fortified city in the whole country, right after Washington, D.C. So it was definitely not going to be taken by the Confederates, right? That was a foregone conclusion. And once Nashville was taken, what happened was that enslaved people from all around the southeast of the United States learned that it was a place where they could go to escape enslavement. Because at this time, everyone who's living in the South is sort of living tentatively. They're like, what's going to happen? Are the Confederates going to win? Is the Union going to come and take our city? Like, what should we do with the enslaved populations? And the people who were enslaved got really bold, and they began self-emancipating. They took themselves out of enslavement, and they ran for the Union lines. And we have some really amazing sources of some chaplains and some soldiers who were stationed here at Fort Negley and in other places in Nashville who talked about receiving these self-emancipating enslaved people. They called them contrabands because, according to law, slavery was still legal, which meant that a person who was enslaved was considered an object, a property, a piece of an item. And so if the Union military accepted them as they ran toward the fort, then it would be contraband property, which is where the term contraband comes from. It's deeply offensive, but also deeply important because it denotes a piece of our history that is sort of like a line in the sand, right? And so this didn't just happen at Fort Negley, it happened everywhere where there was military. And this year, the Sesquicentennial Commission gave out some money to help archaeologists find most of the places in Tennessee where these camps were. And of course, they were where the military was. That's sort of a foregone conclusion, but we were able to do ground penetrating radar and find out exactly where. And here at Fort Negley, that big contraband camp was over on the Bass Street side, right where the Science Museum is, right? So that is where all of these enslaved people settled with the protection of the military. And so many of them were incredibly grateful to be able to evade the slave catchers who came, because they were encircled by Union soldiers who would shoot at the slave catchers who tried to snatch people back into enslavement. And with that gratitude, they volunteered their services to the military, because a lot of enslaved people saw this as an opportunity to rebuild the country in a more fair way, in a way where all people would be considered humans, where all people had rights, right? And this quote right here, I think, is also really telling. We have this wonderful source at Fisk University. It was collected by Ophelia Settle Egypt, who was a professor who worked with W.E.B. Du Bois. And it makes me really upset that we don't know her name, because she was every bit as brilliant as he was. But of course, she's a woman, so she is the one that sort of fades into obscurity. But her papers are still at Fisk. And she spent her whole 20s and 30s, sorry, not her 20s and 30s, the 1920s and 1930s, interviewing people who had been formerly enslaved in the late stages of their lives and asking them, like, but really though, what was it like? Because I don't know if y'all are like history buffs, but before that, we had the WPA narratives, which was young people who were not really, who were not equipped to work on oral histories, who didn't have that background of how to collect oral histories. They went in and they did their best, and they collected stories from people who'd been formerly enslaved. However, Ophelia Settle Egypt was a professor who knew all about enslavement, who was a sociologist, who was well versed in oral history methodologies, and she was also Black. And I think that makes a huge difference in terms of what other Black people were willing to tell her about the worst years of their lives. And so in her papers, you get these amazing narratives that talk about what it was like when the Union soldiers came, what it was like when people were pulled out of their churches, when people were pulled out of the plantations and forced to build Fort Negley, what it was like for people to run away from other states and come into Nashville, sneaking through Confederate lines, like in the dark. They would go at nighttime and try to sneak right between the tents to get into Nashville, to be able to participate in the building of this fort. I mean, this story is absolutely breathtaking. I just can't believe the scope of it. And thanks to Fletch and a lot of other people who've worked so hard on it, we now know that there were a total of 4,993 people who helped to build Fort Negley and the other forts that encircled the capital. They worked on Nashville's defenses. There were several other hundreds who helped with the wartime effort in other ways, right? Either by working in the hospitals, working on the railways, or building the railroads to help bring that infrastructure into the city. Some of them also worked in the brothels, not, as far as I know, not as sex workers, but as supporting the sex workers, cleaning sheets, things like that. So we really had such an amazing show up of Black people who helped the war effort here in Nashville. And then when you go, yes, this is also another one that was collected, which I thought that was really interesting. The Union Army's constant raiding and impressment frightened the young Black children so much they ran when they saw the blue man's approaching. So that speaks to the ways in which the Union military would come in and snatch up. They would just look at people and be like, you're Black, you're coming with me, you're coming to build, right? So it's really important to sort of emphasize that at this time, so many white people, both Union and Confederate and unaffiliated, thought of Black people as objects, didn't have the social background to think of them as human beings. And I think it's really important that we highlight that, because so often in Civil War narratives, it becomes this like really weird, like North versus South, Black versus white. That was never the case, right? It was always people who were willing to try something new, who were willing to try an experiment in freedom where we were all equal, versus people who did not. That was the division, yeah? All right, so we have, during the construction of the fort, it was an arduous process. I think Brandon spoke a little bit about this, so I'm not going to belabor the point. But the work was so incredibly difficult, and the formerly enslaved people, they did their own. They put themselves into squads. They did their own work. They chose exactly how to do it on their own. And the white engineers had to do very little except for give out that day's assignments. They did this despite having insufficient rations, despite having insufficient sanitation, despite having no place to sleep except out on the rocks, bare, like in November. Like, Nashville gets pretty cold. Like, people forget it gets pretty cold here, right? And so, 800 died in the construction because of the lack of sanitation that we had. The fort just had so many people on it between the contraband camps, the builders, the soldiers who were stationed there, that the critical mass was just so big, it was impossible to keep clean. And that was right as germ theory was sort of coming out, right? So many people didn't even subscribe to the germ theory. A lot of them thought that the people who believed in germs were wackos, and so they weren't really paying attention to that. Then you have the U.S. colored troops. So, towards sort of this middle part of the war in 63, 64, we know that it gets a little bit dire, and the war has been dragging on way too long. Lincoln is very conscious of that, and he's conscious of how that looks, how that plays with the American public. When you read newspapers from that time, you read Harper's Bazaar especially, it's so interesting to see the ways that Americans are speaking about their feelings about the war. And so they make this radical decision, right? The Emancipation Proclamation. Anybody who is in a non-occupied southern state is automatically free, which means they are free to join the military. And they join the military, the U.S. military, in segregated regiments called the United States Colored Troops. We had 13,000 black soldiers fighting in the Battle of Nashville. That is the largest amount of black participation out of any Civil War battle. I think that makes it incredibly exciting because it was right after the Emancipation Proclamation. And what is the first thing that so many black people do with their freedom? They volunteer to tie themselves to the military to fight for everybody else. I just think that is one of the most amazing stories I've ever heard come out of a space. And this gentleman right here, Mr. Gary Burke, he's on the board. He is a descendant of one of the soldiers who fought here at the Battle of Peach Orchard Hill, at Granbury's Lynette as well. And his ancestor, Peter Bailey, was also stationed here after the war, right? So after the war, what happens is that the country is sort of like in a loss, right? Like, the country realizes, like, if we don't inject money into this region, that the freedoms that we fought for are not going to last. And so they make this grand plan for Reconstruction, and they allow a lot of the black soldiers who fought in the Battle of Nashville to be stationed at those forts that they created as a way to sort of like help the city to reconstruct and to ensure that the city is not going to slide back into the enslaving past that it once had. And so Gary Burke's ancestor, Peter Bailey, was one of those people stationed at Fort Negley overseeing things. And because Fort Negley had all of these black soldiers who had been fighting for freedom in it, a lot of black people, a lot of black veterans and their families settled right at the foot of this fort because it was in proximity to the safety, right? Which means that over where the Science Center is, that whole area became the Bass Street community. It was started by veterans who fought in the Battle of Nashville and who were here at Fort Negley. So really, when you look at the Bass Street community, there's just such an amazing, rich history in terms of like people coming from all over the South to help build this fort, people dropping everything to fight in the military, people staying because they had nowhere else to go back to, right? You're not going to go back to the plantation. So they stayed here in the city, became urban citizens, right? Urban dwellers. And they started an urban neighborhood right here. And we're not the only one either. Like, if you think about that circle, that semicircle that is like around our capital, all of the places where there was a fort, that is where a black neighborhood sprung up, because that is where safety was for black people, right? That is why Fisk and TSU, they're right next to Fort Gillum. Fort Gillum is where Jubilee Hall is now. So after Fort Gillum was deconstructed, Jubilee Hall was planked on top of it, and that became Fisk University, and all the people lived right around it because it was one of the safest places to be in Nashville. Right. And the very first thing that this community did, these Bass Street neighbors of ours, they built the church, because of course they did, right? Because they are Tennesseans, and because Tennesseans love our churches, right? And so they built the Bass Street Church. It was one of the early churches. It was a missionary church, which meant that it was people from up north, in the churches up north, that came down with their money to help rebuild and create churches with academies attached to them that would help formerly enslaved people learn to read, write, and integrate into society. And so sometimes they were white, sometimes they were black. Often it was a combination of black and white effort from the north, which is really interesting. And the Bass Street Church was no exception. Also, the one on Capitol Hill was one of those churches. I think all the really big AME churches were missionary churches to start with, which is why they still have such robust populations, right? Because those congregations, you go where your mother went and she goes where her mother went, and on, right? So they can be traced directly to the birth of American freedom, which is why, consequently, so many of our black churches were where the civil rights movement began, right? It just makes sense, because this is the genesis of our civil rights movement. The Civil War was a civil rights movement for the black people who participated in it, right? So I wanted to show you these photos. That very first one is the very first church that was right next to the Science Center. The archaeologists from MTSU were able to excavate part of it, and that was very exciting. We invited the pastor of the current church to come down with some of his members who had attended that church as children, which is really amazing. So they attended the original Bass Street Baptist Church in the 1950s as children, and then when the church was forced to move, it moved over on 12th, which is that second picture at the top. It was over on 12th Avenue, but of course, as we know, 12th is super fancy now, so there is no black church there. So it moved once again over here. This is the current church that is still in operation at the bottom. It's over on Brick Church Pike up in North Nashville. And so when you think about this community of veterans who began this church, they essentially, you know how I said that they stayed next to all of their forts, right? The forts were where the black neighborhoods were. And that is because of racist terrorism. So Nashville had particularly egregious racist terrorism that, for one reason or another, doesn't make it into the popular consciousness in the same way, right? Because when you think about racist terrorism, you think about the Ku Klux Klan, you think about all of the bombings, right? People talk about Birmingham, it's Bombingham, right? People kind of think about other places, think about Selma, think about Mississippi. But Nashville was pretty egregious as well. So our Ku Klux Klan was incredibly strong during the 1920s, but it started even earlier than that. And we have one of the most amazing stories to have come out of this. There's a man called Leander Woods. And I would like you to remember that name, Leander Woods. So I'm going to say it often, Leander Woods, until it burrows into your brain and becomes part of your memory, Leander Woods, because I love this story more than any story I've come across in my life. So Leander Woods was a veteran. He was a black soldier who fought in the Battle of Nashville. And after the Battle of Nashville, he didn't really know what to do with himself, right? Because Leander Woods had this life that was so incredibly brutal. He grew up in a sawmill up right on the border between Clarksville, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Excuse me. So he grows up in this sawmill. Just gonna get some water. Grows up in this sawmill, and in this sawmill, there is a slave uprising. So the people he's working with, his family members, his friends, they decide that they're going to kill the enslaver and take over or escape or do something. They just can't live like that anymore. But it fails, of course. And so all of the people Leander Woods worked with, they get beheaded by the enslaver who owned the sawmill, and then their heads get put on pikes. And this was in the 1850s. It was, yeah, it's pretty recent. It's really scary to think about. We hear these stories a lot about these things happening in Cuba and in the Caribbean, but they happened here in Tennessee too. It was the same story. So Leander Woods had to walk past the severed heads of the people that he grew up with every day on his way to work when he was enslaved. So the second he became free, he was I'm joining the military. I'm going to get them back. Right, and so he fights in the Battle of Nashville. His service record is amazing. He does get demoted, so he gets promoted for his courage. The same courage that makes him such a good soldier also makes him a very bad person to obey. He is not very obedient as a person, so he gets demoted by the end, which means his pension also shrinks. So then after the war, he spends some time trying to sort of figure out what he's going to do with his life. And if you look at the white newspapers, he was quite a scoundrel. He's arrested multiple times. He has had many wives, perhaps. He maybe steals the pension of a soldier who was dead, who didn't have a widow. He does a lot of things. But if you ask the black newspapers, he was a hero because he heard about the Ku Klux Klan coming to Fort Negley after the war, right? So this was after Reconstruction, right? Reconstruction fails. the United States pulls out way before they should have, which means that the South is sort of left on its own to figure stuff out. So during this failure of Reconstruction, these white supremacist terror groups, they rise up again, including the Ku Klux Klan, which of course had its headquarters here in Nashville. And so when they rise up, they decide, like, how do we terrorize the Black community into compliance? We find all of the symbols that are the most important to Black people, and we wreck them. And so you come to Fort Negley, which is the symbol of freedom. It is the tallest hill, right? It is this big white limestone fortification that lets the city know, hey, Black people built this, defended this, and won their freedom. Like, it is a giant middle finger to people who did not agree with the end of enslavement, right? And because of that, the KKK would come up and burn crosses at the top of the hill. And then on the way down, they would ride their horses down and smash up the chicken coops of the people living on Bass Street. And there was a woman who lived there on her own. We don't know her name, but she appears in the newspapers as Leander Woods' wife or girlfriend or sister, depending on, who knows, right? Like, I think that he was a serial dater, so serial cheater. So I think at different times when he was stopped, he might have said different things to different people about her. We don't think that they were related because he came from so far and she was from here, but who knows? The point is, though, that she told Leander that she was really afraid because the KKK had threatened her. After they smashed up and killed her chickens, they told her that she would be next, and she believed them because she had no reason not to. Remember, this is a time where Black communities in other cities are being burned, and their people are being forced out, right? So this happens everywhere. This happens in small places like Ocoee, Florida, happens in big places like Tulsa, Oklahoma. This is the time when cities decide, hey, we don't want Black people in our city, let's burn them. And so people in Bass Street, they're terrified. They know that this could happen to their neighborhood too. And so Leander Woods, he, just like many of the people in the Battle of Nashville, he kept his arms from the Civil War. Something I didn't even know until I started working on this project was that the US military gave its soldiers an option. They were like, you can get your full pension package when you leave, or we can cut your pension a little bit and you can hold on to your arms if you want to. And of course, a lot of formerly enslaved people who knew just how ugly things could get, they kept their arms, right? They kept that musket and that bayonet. And so Leander Woods calls up his other friends who kept their muskets and bayonets, and he said, hey friends, let's club our money together and get a big keg of gunpowder, and then let's just wait for the KKK and see what happens. And what happened was that after that, I never did see another newspaper article about the KKK being at Fort Negley until the 1950s. So whatever happened on that hill, we'll probably never know, but it worked because Bass Street remained. So I think Leander Woods deserves everything for that. Leander Woods may be the reason we have such a robust Black community even today. All right, sorry, that was a giant detour, but I just love him so much, I just can't stop talking about him. Thank you. So let me find my place. All right, yes, so I already showed this one, so we can move on. Aha, this one. So this one always gets people's eyebrows up. And I never really thought to put these maps together, but these three maps, I wish they were a little bit easier to see, but you sort of get the gist, right? So that first one is the Civil War map that I showed you. You can see the fortifications in this little circle around the Capitol, right? Then that second map's from the 1940s. So it's like 60 years later. And you can see that that same semicircle where all of the forts were are now where all the Black neighborhoods are, which means that this is an insurance map. Essentially, the insurance company adjusters were saying this is like where the unsafe bits of Nashville are, so we're going to value those lower. So that's where all the cheap housing is. And of course, as you know, like once you deem a neighborhood of lower value and the housing prices go down, those neighborhoods get blighted by the city, right? The city stops investing in that infrastructure, and so they become dangerous. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And so then when you look at this map of today, you look at the highway systems, why it's the same thing. That circle of where Black people lived are now our highways, and the Black communities have had to deal with being bisected, having a lot of people eminent domained moved out of their homes without proper recompensation. Compensation, recompense, both. So I think these maps really sort of illustrate really sharply how this Civil War history still matters, right? And so how the things that happened at Bass Street sort of reverberate into the present, and you can see like all the ways in which the Black community has been disrupted. All right, so this is where I come in, I guess. So in 2017, when part of Fort Negley was sold for a mixed-use development, back when Mayor Megan Barry was in charge, I was just so incensed. And so I came to the board meeting, and I came to the council meeting and, I had my papers prepared as I do today, but I didn't look at them as I didn't today. But I had them, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna read to them and tell them exactly why they can't do that to Fort Negley. That's our city's heritage, how dare they? But I didn't read the paper. Instead, my soul just left my body and my anger took over. I just let him have it. It was like, how dare you? And I'm sure it's filmed somewhere. I have not looked. I don't want to know what I said. But the very best thing to come out of that was that there were several descendants there, especially Mr. Burke and a couple of others, who approached me afterward, and they were like, hey, your anger could be super useful. Do you want to channel that into doing something about it? And I was like, absolutely, let's do this. And so together we decided to start the Fort Negley Descendants Project. So essentially they found, I didn't find anyone, they found themselves and they found each other, all the people who knew that they had ancestry at this fort. And I recorded their stories and I edited them and I found historic documents to back up what they were saying. I found images and I put them up on the Fort Negley Descendants Project YouTube page. And then we had a big screening. We invited the mayor. She did not come, but we tried. But several other people came, including people who write for the newspapers, which was super useful. And so we had a couple of bits in the Scene and in the Tennessean. We were interviewed a few times by J.R. Lind and a couple of other reporters who were local at the time. And we were able to really get the story out and to show people that this isn't just a wreck or a ruin here. This isn't just a relic from a past time, that this is a living place of cultural heritage that has a population that still comes to it, that still practices here, that still puts on the uniform, as you will see if you come this weekend, which you should, that still puts on the uniform, that still engages with the public, that still, for them, this history is their genesis. This is where they stopped becoming objects and started becoming people legally. It's such a big deal, and the idea that it could be erased for condos, what are we doing? It was wild. Yes, and so I also worked with some of the descendants to create a documentary with these oral histories, because once I started doing them, more and more people came out of the woodwork. They were like, well, I'm also related to this fort. Here's my documentation. Here's my family tree. I started working with the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, the Nashville chapter, which meets here. And I got to meet so many people who had connections to these 19,000 people that are in my database. And it was just such a privilege to be able to, spend so many years looking at all the documents of their ancestors, and then to have their descendants of 3, 4, 5, 6 generations later come up and say, hey, Dr. Sutton, I'm here. And just to get to know, oh, these are the faces. This is what your ancestor would have looked like. You're here. And it was just really wonderful for them to come together. So we made a documentary called What Happened to Bass Street. We showed it here on Juneteenth. Which was a very special day for everyone. And now this documentary is doing the film festival circuit. So we've been accepted to 2 film festivals so far, Rocket City, which is in Huntsville, and Kwanzaa Film Festival, which is up in Harlem, which is happening during Kwanzaa, so the 26th and 27th of December. So far, no awards, but we've still got to hear back from 15 others, so we will see. But we're just very excited to be able to get the story of Bass Street out to the world, because it is made by descendants for the world, to let the world know, hey, we're still here. Nashville's Black community comes from hella amazing history, and we're still here. I also wanted to kind of talk about how this fort, because of all of this work, right, it has all of these pieces that are called intangible cultural heritage, which is a really fancy way of just saying things that occur in a space that sort of activate the space and make it something deeply important to our self-understanding. And one of those is the National Juneteenth Festival, right? We started in 2021, which is the year that the new mayor, Mayor Cooper, made it a city holiday, and it also became a federal holiday. So now, no, stop. Well, yeah, okay, that's fine. So this is Eleanor Fleming. She was one of the very first descendants I met, along with Gary Burke. She's an epidemiological dentist at the University of Maryland's dental school. Why is it now doing it automatically? Okay. Anyway, so here she is speaking at the very first Juneteenth about her ancestors, Ruffin and Egbert Bright, who were 2 of the laborers who helped to build Fort Negley. They were enslaved over at Scruggs Place, which is right across the street from the Belle Meade plantation in that area of our city. They were pulled out by some federal soldiers. We'll never know who that was. They were brought here to Fort Negley to labor, and they survived the process. They were 2 of the people who lived, a father and son. And they lived to create a beautiful large family that has been in Nashville for generations. Eleanor was educated at Vanderbilt and at Meharry, and she is carrying that legacy on. She's also one of the people who is a consultant for the new master plan, which if you haven't yet availed yourself, there are some beautiful posters outside that sort of talk about the master plan from Hodgson Douglas Landscape Architects, who are sort of the orchestrators of this. And if you ever have some time on your hands, it's a really great time to contact parks and just let them know like how grateful we are that they've chosen Hodgson Douglas and that they have set aside some funds that are really important to pay consultants to work on this space, because we have 3 descendants. So descendants of the laborers, descendants of the USCT, and descendants of the Bass Street community who are working as an official capacity as advisors, who are paid to help give their stories, their oral traditions, their understanding of the fort, so that when you come back here in 2 years, hopefully, maybe 3, because you know how construction is in Nashville, maybe 4, maybe 5. Let's hope it gets done quickly. So but when you come back here, you'll be able to go to the interpretive plazas and read about the people here who started it all, and the descendants who are still alive and well, who are still helping to shape the city and make it what it is. So that is what I've got. I also wanted to share with you this again, because this is another piece of what we call intangible cultural heritage, right? These events, these reenactments, these living historians, the people who are descended from these soldiers who put on that uniform again and who tell you about how hard it was and what they did and their understanding of their ancestors, that is what makes a city. That is what makes our understanding of self. And so it's really important to all take that responsibility to be the keepers of memory, right? It can't just be historians, it has to be every single person. Take those stories inside of yourself and let them change you. And be proud to be part of a city that has such an amazing history, because it really is truly spectacular. All right, I'm gonna put my mask back on, unless you can't hear me, but I'd love to have your questions now. Thank you. Whew.
Do you know where the stone was quarried that was used in the construction?
Yeah, we think it came directly from this hill. So they just like picked pieces of the hill and hollowed it out.
And then after the Civil War, was the site looted for quarried stone that was maybe used to build other buildings in Nashville?
Yeah, we're almost certain that's what happened. Can't prove it, but it just makes the most sense in terms of how things were, because once Reconstruction was over and the military presence left the fort, it was just sort of like, it was a free-for-all. It was just there. A lot of people had really strong feelings about it. A lot of people looted it for artifacts, but also for whatever other resources they could pull. They also pulled the timber down that was that created some of those defenses as well. Yeah. Yep.
What are the plans for the green property?
Oh, yeah, that's exciting. So they are currently in talks about whether or not we can get the money together to get the landscape architects to incorporate the green property into the rest of it. So for those of you who don't know, the green property is, if you go down to Bass Street where the Science Center is, and you keep going straight out, there's a cemetery, but right before you hit the cemetery, there's a little fence that says property of green, do not come in. And if you go in, there's a huge, beautiful warehouse building that was used to create a lot of country music, like music video backgrounds. Also, I think Athena of the Parthenon, the Athena sculpture, he worked in there. And that huge building has just been purchased by the Friends of Fort Negley with the help of the Battlefield Trust, the National Battlefield Trust, and the Tennessee State, who is it, the Tennessee State Commission? Yes, the Historic Commission and the War Commission. They all pitched in so we could buy this property at cost, which was very kind of the owner, Sherby Green, and we're going to incorporate it into the master plan of the park. I think that will happen next year, so after next year we'll know what that will look like and how that will be, but we think that space could be used for all kinds of really interesting things.
So the building is dead?
Oh yeah, the building's gonna stay, for sure. Yeah, that building is super valuable, and we need event space, we need hopefully a museum space. I'm gonna fight real hard for museum space.
And I love your story about the block brothers letting the kids in the neighborhood come in and use the warehouse for roller skating. Am I right?
Yeah. So when we collected oral histories from the people who grew up on Bass Street, a lot of them said that when they were children, that building used to be a walnut processing plant called Block Brothers. And so during the weekends, they would be kind and they would clear out all of the walnut material and machinery and the bags of like shells and things. And they would allow the kids to use it as a roller skating rink because it was, segregated Nashville. There weren't as many opportunities for black children to do things outside of their neighborhoods. And this was right at the edge of their neighborhood. And the man who owned it had a really great relationship with the locals, and so he would allow the local children to use that as a recreational space, which was very important because at that time, Fort Negley had become a whites-only park. So they weren't even allowed to be on their own space anymore. Yeah. Back there? Stripes? Yeah.
I'm new to, fairly new to Nashville.
Welcome.
I'm wondering about the history of the property that became the adventure center.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same exact history as Fort Negley, right? That's where the contraband people were pitching their makeshift tents and staying. And then after that, that became part of the Bass Street community. So literally underneath the Science Center, there are foundations of some of those early homes of some of the first free black people of Nashville, which is just such a shame, right? Like, it kills me that happened. But we're so lucky that there still is a small piece of that street that is become untouched because the way development works, they just turned it into part of the park. But most of Bass Street is currently underneath those highways. So that is where almost all the homes of the people who I interview are. And I just 2 weeks ago, I interviewed a family, and it was very touching because Christina Zimmerman, she said, I am in my 70s, and every single home I've lived in Nashville has been bulldozed. And so there is no space I can go back to. But your work here makes me think that maybe we won't be forgotten, which is just like such a oh, I hope not. I really hope so. I'm gonna do my best to make sure we remember, because the Bass Street neighbors, they did everything for us. Yep.
Has anybody gathered Ophelia's interviews and put them into book form?
Yeah, so we got really lucky. Her papers were left at Fisk University, and they're at special collections, and they were published one time in the 1940s. That was the last time the book was published, and it's out of print now, so I haven't been able to find it. But you can still go to Fisk University Special Collections and ask to see them. So they do exist. I was able to pull out all of the names and put them into my database of everybody who was associated with this space. But I would really love to see them publish them again. I know that that's maybe tricky, but it would be wonderful to get to have those for everybody because they're such wonderful primary sources.
Fort Negley was a Union fort, and Fort Harrison was a Confederate fort. What other forts do we have out here?
Yeah, we've got a ton. Let's see if I can find you a picture. It's not going to fully explain it, but you can at least get an idea. Yeah, so when you look at this map here, right, so you've got, I'll come up in front. So Fort Negley would have been like right about here, right? And then you have Fort Casino, I think is this one, or perhaps this one. It's one of these two. Fort Casino is where the reservoir is now, right? So the reservoir was put on top of Fort Casino. At that time it was the Casino Blockhouse. And you could see, like if you go to the top of Fort Negley, you can see straight to the reservoir, right? So they would be able to signal each other with flags. And then there's Fort Morton, which is where, E.S. Rose Park, that it was built on top of Fort Morton, and that's like the Edge Hill neighborhood. Then you have Fort Dillon, which was at Fisk University. You also have Fort Sam Houston, which is where the de Montbriand traffic circle is. If you all have gone across those naked bodies, that's there. Yeah, and a couple of others that are a bit smaller. And they were all connected by this red line here, which were the entrenchments that Brandon Hewlett is working on finding and tracing. So you could really see it. This was like a super fortified capital, right? The capital's right there. It's completely surrounded. And in the water, there were gunboats that had wonderful coverage as well. So attacking Nashville was just one of the most foolish things that could happen. But also there was no way the Confederates could have even had a hope of winning without attacking Nashville. So they were sort of between a rock and a hard place, right? Any other questions? Yeah?
Is there a Bass Street community marker or one in progress?
There is not, but it is a huge part of the master planning process. So there's going to be an entire plaza that they're going to put out there that's going to have interpretive panels because it is like such an important part of our history. And we're working with the archaeologists as well to see if we can get some of the artifacts that were found, either put into plexiglass there, or at least get photographs put up into that into that space so people can see exactly what has been found and what is there. So I'm super excited about that. I also, just personally, I want to find a way to raise money to get a Leander Woods somewhere on this site, because I think we need a beautiful statue of this man who is my new historic hero. Yeah.
Question. I know that there were whites from the Knoxville area who fought with the Union, including a vice president and then president.
Right.
But what about Nashville?
Oh, yeah.
Whites from here who
Of course.
fought with the Union?
Yeah. So Nashville was 50-50. The white population was 50-50 split. Like, I think people always think, like, oh, this is like a Confederate city. Like, I wouldn't call it that. Really, like, the white people were split 50-50 at the beginning of the war, and then as the war kind of went on and progressed, that changed as well, right? So, and then if you combine the white and the black populations, that makes us a majority Union state, really, if you think about it like that. So,
Well, what about during Reconstruction and after, with these white veterans,
yeah.
Union veterans?
Yeah, a lot of them went back to where they were from. So, like, we didn't have as many that settled. So, like, obviously the Nashville ones, they stayed here. The ones who were from other places who came down to fight in the Battle of Nashville, they went back home, most of them, because they were excited to get back to their families. So we didn't have as much settlement from outside as we did of the black population. We also had, so there were a lot of Minnesotans as well who fought in the Battle of Nashville, strangely. So the Battle of Nashville has a lot of white Nashvillians who fought, but we also have a ton of Minnesotans, and it's because Minnesota had a very large German population. And the Germans were like Lincoln's biggest fans, right? Like, they were Lincoln's biggest supporters. And it's because the Germans that migrated here, I mean, you know, they were the good Germans, I guess. Like, they were anti-slavery. Their religion was anti-slavery. And so a lot of them felt bound to help fight. And so they joined the war a little bit later once the black people had joined the war, and then they came down. And we have a lot of wonderful sources of chaplains, especially from Minnesota, who sat down and, like, who received the contrabands that came in, looked them over, made sure they had as much as they could in terms of food and shelter and instructions. So there are a lot of really rich sources that come to us from Minnesota, and a few of them are in the German language. They kept diaries in their own language. All right, so please do not forget this weekend.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Sutton. That was probably the fastest delivered lecture we've ever heard. However, we learned a lot, and we support all the causes that you brought up 100%, because we've been here enjoying this center. And I hope you all can come this weekend, one of the days. That would be wonderful. Let's hope the weather is supposed to be good, is it?
Great weather.
Wonderful. See you this weekend. See you next Tuesday at the Wessex, right? And I'm curious how many people went there today. Anyway, thank you again. Come back and visit us. Thank you.